Why do we hallucinate? Obviously, it seems to be some sort of error in our brain, but how can a brain that usually works correctly start to experience things that are not there? In fact, weak hallucinations are much more easy, right? And of course, much more frequent. It's much easier to imagine that your visual system allowing you to hallucinate some faces in the air, for example, but it is much less likely that those faces would actually speak to you. So, what is happening here? In the case of strong hallucination, if we want to explain this phenomenon, without a visit to the Wuland, how can an error have so much details? Well, for us to be able to imagine what a possible answer to this dilemma would look like, we first need to conduct a thought experiment provided by the philosopher Daniel Dennett. It is a party game called Psychoanalysis. Now imagine you are at a party with your friends and you want to play a game. One person, let's call him Dan, has to leave the room, but before he does, he is told that once you're not in the room, we're going to ask one of us to recall a recent dream. And then he or she has to tell it with details to the rest of us. So once you come back, you will only have to ask yes-no questions. That's your job. Your job is to ask yes-no questions to find out the dream. And when you feel that you've had enough, basically you've asked enough questions, now you'll have to use psychoanalytical techniques to find out who was the person that originally had this dream. Now, once Dan leaves the room, the party leader explains to everyone else that, in fact, there is not going to be any dream. This is a prank. When Dan comes back, whatever he asks, you answer yes or no, following a rule, a very simple rule. If the last letter of the last word of his sentence ends in the letter P, English letter P, or anything before P, then you answer yes. And if the last letter of the last word of his sentence ends in something after P, then you answer no. For example, if he asks, is the dream about a girl? Well, L is before P, so the answer is yes. But if he asks, are there any birds in it? Well, the letter T is after P, so the answer is no. There's only one rule though, and that's a non-contradiction rule. You don't want Dan to find out that there is something rigged about the game, right? So the non-contradiction rule states that if something has already been established, you will follow that line. So for example, if Dan asks, is a dream about a girl? The answer is yes, right? But then if he later forgets or just for whatever reason asks, are there any female characters in it? Technically, because of the T, you have to answer no. But because of the non-contradiction rule that overrides that, you would answer yes and follow along. So I recommend you do this game when there's at least a little bit of your consciousness left. Well, that's a game. And it's quite similar to what we know from visual systems. It's a good metaphor for visual system because such a system cannot be possibly purely bottom-up or purely data-driven. It needs to have some sort of top-down hypothesis too. We're going to talk more about this bottom-up and top-down stuff in the future. Now, if you try this game, you'll soon notice that, if the person is not asking like ridiculous questions, for example, like, I don't know, is the dream an exact word-by-word definition of the War and Peace, for example? If there are no such questions, there are kind of like interesting questions involved, you'll see that it can lead to very bizarre and interesting images. And then actually, Dan might conclude that, the person who has had this dream is like crazy. The question is, who is the author of this dream? And yet the point is that there is no such person. In fact, it is Dan who is asking all of these weird questions. So, in a sense, maybe Dan is, the weird hero of the story. But, is he the author of the story? I mean, he is asking the questions, but the answers are being provided at random. So, in a sense, we could say that, the kinds of questions that are being asked kind of reflect Dan's concerns, but the answers are almost random. So it cannot be that Dan is the author of the story. It is more like that this story has no author, no single author. and it is just being written as a natural byproduct of independent processes just collaborating. Also, even the non-contradiction rule is not necessary. I mean, in our story with Dan, Dan might be able to detect, any logical error in the story, in a sense that, oh, you said it was about a girl, but then you said no female characters in it, there's something up, da 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 da. But a visual system doesn't have to necessarily do that. The visual system can always detect that as a change. So it can be like, okay, I see an apple, now I see a mug, now I see a mug, now I see a face, now I see a face, and so on. So it doesn't even have to be a non-contradiction rule for the visual system to fall into this kind of trap. And I'm using visual system because visual system is studied like extensively, and it's much easier to relate to because we know so much more about it. But this whole idea can be true of any other system in the brain. So this by no means is a complete account of how hallucinations happen in the brain or any of that. This is simply just a way to think about brain processes in a different way, and to maybe start to consider how an answer to these kind of questions may look like. And that's it, we've made it. So if you like what I do, give this video a thumbs up, like that. Your likes and subscriptions and all these things helps me actually expand this channel. Thank you for listening, and until next time.